I never expected my summer job at Willow Creek Antique Emporium to change my life. Nestled between the bustling streets of an old town, the shop was a treasure trove of forgotten relics and timeless curiosities. As the new assistant, I imagined my days would be filled with cataloging vintage items, chatting with collectors, and maybe uncovering a few hidden gems. But what I discovered was something far beyond my wildest imaginings. From the moment I stepped inside, the shop felt like stepping into another era. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and lavender, and every corner held a story waiting to be told. Mr. Pembroke, the owner, was a tall man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold countless secrets. He welcomed me warmly, showing me around the vast space filled with everything from delicate porcelain dolls to sturdy brass lanterns. At first, everything was as I expected. I learned to dust antique furniture, arrange display cases, and assist customers with their unique finds. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice a peculiar section in the back of the store, hidden behind heavy velvet curtains. It was a room I'd never seen before, filled with objects that seemed untouched by time. Each item was meticulously placed, almost as if they were part of a larger, hidden narrative. One evening, after the last customer had left and the town had settled into a quiet lull, I found myself drawn to that mysterious room. The soft glow of a single lamp illuminated the shelves, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. As I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. The air was different here, thicker, almost electric with an unspoken presence. I reached out to touch a beautifully carved music box sitting atop a dusty shelf. As my fingers brushed the delicate surface, the room seemed to come alive. The music box sprang open, playing a hauntingly familiar melody that echoed through the space. Suddenly, the room transformed around me. I was no longer in the antique shop, but standing in the middle of a grand ballroom, filled with people dressed in elegant attire from another century. Confused and disoriented, I wandered through the crowd, noticing that everyone seemed to recognize me. They smiled and greeted me warmly, as if I belonged there. I approached a woman in a flowing gown who looked strikingly like Mr. Pembroke. "Welcome," she said softly. "We've been waiting for you." Before I could respond, the scene shifted again. I found myself back in the antique room, the music box silent once more. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Determined to uncover the truth, I began to investigate the hidden room further. I discovered old journals and letters tucked away in drawers, detailing the lives of those who had owned the shop before me. Each entry spoke of mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena tied to the very objects they cherished. One night, as I pored over the latest journal entry, Mr. Pembroke appeared beside me. His expression was grave. "You've seen too much," he whispered. "The objects in this room hold memories, lives intertwined with the past. They can draw you in, make you a part of their stories. You must be careful." Despite his warning, my curiosity only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was meant to discover, something that connected me to the shop in ways I couldn't understand. Late one night, I decided to experiment with the music box again, hoping to unlock its secrets. As the melody played, the room transformed once more, and I was thrust into another vivid scene, a sunlit garden where children laughed and played, their joy palpable. In each of these alternate realities, I encountered versions of myself, living lives I had never known. Some were happy, others marked by sorrow and loss. With each visit, I felt pieces of my own identity slipping away, replaced by fragments of these other lives. The boundaries between my reality and theirs began to blur, leaving me questioning who I truly was. Desperate for answers, I confronted Mr. Pembroke. "Why are these objects affecting me? What do you want from me?" He sighed deeply, his eyes reflecting the weight of centuries. "The Emporium is a sanctuary for lost memories and forgotten lives. It preserves their stories, but it also needs new ones to keep the balance. By engaging with these objects, you're helping to maintain that balance. But too much involvement can be dangerous. Realizing the gravity of my situation, I decided to heed his advice. I began to focus on my duties, helping customers find pieces that resonated with them while avoiding the allure of the hidden room. However, the pull was relentless. Each day the objects seemed to call out to me, whispering fragments of stories that begged to be told. One stormy night the shop was nearly empty, save for Mr. Pembroke and me. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as I stood before the hidden room. The objects seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light, their silent stories yearning to be heard. Summoning my courage, I reached out and touched a delicate locket. Instantly, the room transformed and I was enveloped in a whirlwind of memories. Joy, pain, love, and loss, all swirling around me. I felt a presence beside me, a reflection of myself, but older and wiser. You have the power to choose, it said. Embrace your story, but remember where you belong. With a newfound resolve, I released the locket and stepped back into the antique room. The storm outside had subsided, and a sense of calm settled over the shop. Mr. Pembroke looked at me with understanding. "You've learned the balance," he said. "Now you must continue to protect these stories, ensuring they remain preserved without overwhelming you." From that day forward, I embraced my role with a deeper sense of purpose. If it weren't worth saving myself, there must be something that worth saving now. I still encountered the mysterious objects and the memories they held, but I managed to maintain my connection to the present. The Emporium became not just a job, but a bridge between worlds, a place where stories lived on and memories were cherished. As the years passed, I found peace in knowing that each object held a piece of someone's life, including my own. And though the allure of the hidden room occasionally called to me, I stood strong, guarding the balance between past and present. The Willow Creek Antique Emporium remained a sanctuary of stories, and I was its steadfast guardian, ensuring that every tale was remembered and every memory honored. I was 14 the winter my Aunt Belinda invited me and 3 classmates to join her at Silverhearth Lodge, a sprawling cabin tucked high in the Mist Vale Mountains. The year was 1956, and I remember riding in the back of Aunt Belinda's dusty pickup, feeling the icy wind whip my cheeks. My friends were sprawled out beside me, squinting into the sharp sunlight that glittered over snowy pines. We had all jumped at the chance to spend a long weekend away from our humdrum routines, especially after hearing rumors that Silverhearth Lodge had hidden rooms, towering rafters, and an endless network of secret passageways. At that age, everything carried the promise of adventure. Our little group was a strange combination of personalities. I had known Amity since 2nd grade. She had an uncanny knack for telling jokes at precisely the wrong time, but she could make anyone smile. Gilbert was the studious one, always fiddling with his thick-rimmed spectacles and muttering about new scientific experiments he wanted to try. Corin was quiet, prone to scribbling songs in a worn notebook or else wandering off to daydream by herself. Then there was Elias. He had joined our school that year and had quickly become part of our circle without much fuss. He was polite, eager to please, and seemed thrilled to be invited on this trip. We had no clue how complicated he really was beneath that soft-spoken demeanor. By the time we arrived, the sun had started dipping behind the jagged peaks, casting golden streaks on the massive logs that formed Silverhearth's walls. Aunt Belinda led us inside, flicking on lanterns and lighting a few lamps, because the electrical wiring in the old lodge wasn't always reliable. "Make yourselves at home," she said, flashing us a grin. "But don't go unlocking every door you see. Some of them haven't been opened in years." She said it with a teasing wink, though it felt like a gentle warning too. Amity squealed at the sight of a stuffed brown bear by the stairwell, then ran upstairs to pick out a room. I followed, curiosity bouncing through my veins. The 2nd floor's wooden corridor creaked beneath our boots. There were 6 rooms, each with thick quilts on 4-poster beds, braided rugs on the floor, and tall windows looking out over a snowy wilderness. I claimed the room at the far end, which had an antique writing desk. Elias set his bag in the room across from mine and shot me a shy smile, as if asking silently if he'd chosen the right place. Meanwhile, Gilbert and Corin stomped around excitedly, trying to figure out which rooms had the best views. That first night, everything felt like a grand adventure. Aunt Belinda served steaming bowls of venison stew in the lodge's cozy kitchen, its walls lined with copper pots and cast-iron skillets. Afterward, we plopped by the fireplace in the main sitting room, telling ghost stories we'd heard around school. The logs popped and crackled, swirling sparks through the air. In a few hours, we found ourselves yawning. The long drive and the bright cold had worn us down. I was almost asleep when I noticed a distant tapping. It echoed faintly in the rafters above my bed, like a steady knock against old wood. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the usual creaks of an aging cabin. But there was a rhythm to it. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 taps, another pause. I sat up, heart pounding. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Telling myself I was just overexcited, I lay back down, drifting into restless dreams. The next day promised exploration. Snowdrifts reached almost to my knees outside, so we stuck to wandering through the lodge's labyrinthine halls. Aunt Belinda was off collecting supplies from a nearby town, leaving us a basket of pastries and a note that she would return by late afternoon. Gilbert was especially eager to study the lodge's architecture. He scribbled notes on a small scratch pad, peering at door frames and old hinges. Amity teased him, joking that he was more interested in dusty locks than the promise of hidden rooms. But to my surprise, it was Elias who seemed the most fascinated by each closed doorway we passed. "Wonder what's in there," Elias murmured, trailing a gloved hand over a locked handle. His eyes had a faraway gleam, as if imagining entire worlds lying in wait. Corin drifted along behind the group, humming a tune she'd composed the night before. She had told me earlier that the lodge's eerie stillness inspired her, though she felt uneasy whenever she caught sight of her own reflection in the windows. "It's like I'm a stranger looking in," she'd said. By noon we had ventured into a narrow passage behind the second-floor staircase. It led to a cramped storage attic stuffed with old trunks and battered boxes. The floor sagged, and beams angled overhead, so we had to crouch. We took turns rummaging through dusty crates, unearthing antique lanterns, discolored tapestries, and even a broken mirror. Nothing of real value, just remnants of a past that felt both intriguing and slightly menacing. Around this time, I realized something was missing. I had been wearing a small heart-shaped locket given to me by my grandmother, but it was gone from my collar. Panicking, I checked every pocket, shook out my coat, and retraced my steps through the attic. No luck. Amelie tried to calm me, insisting it had probably come loose and was waiting somewhere back in my room, but I was sure I'd felt it clasped around my neck just before we'd climbed into the attic. My worries only grew when the others began to notice small items missing too. Gilbert searched all over for a brand new pen he'd stashed in his coat. Corin couldn't find her sheet of unfinished lyrics. Even Amity reported she was missing a little tin of candies she always carried. At first we joked about some mischievous ghost rummaging through our things, but a knot of unease took hold in my stomach. A knot filled with a grace growth of grass and never-growing vines. A short tent of candies took hold in my stomach. Something about the vanishings felt targeted, too consistent to be an accident. Aunt Belinda returned that afternoon, oblivious to our jitters. She was excited to show us a new puzzle she had picked up in town, a complicated mosaic board that fit together in 100 different ways. We spent the early evening in the sitting room, half-heartedly fiddling with the puzzle. I kept glancing at Elias, thinking he seemed strangely calm about everything. In fact, he almost looked pleased. Whenever I'd catch his eye, though, he'd force a kindly smile as if to say, "Don't worry, everything's fine," but my gut insisted otherwise. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed, wide awake, watching the snow swirl beyond the tall window. Around 2 in the morning, I heard hushed voices from the corridor. Curious, I slid out of bed and cracked my door open just an inch. There, in the gloom, I spotted Elias standing at the far end of the hall, talking to himself. At least that's how it looked. His lips moved in whispered words I couldn't make out. His posture was rigid, as though he fought some invisible pressure. He must have sensed me, because he suddenly stopped and turned in my direction. I held my breath. For a terrifying second, his silhouette remained motionless. Then he slipped into the shadows and was gone. When I woke the next morning, I tried to pretend it hadn't happened. I told myself I was just sleepy and had imagined the whole incident. Still, I felt uneasy while we prepared breakfast in the kitchen. The smell of sizzling bacon and coffee drifted around, comforting but not enough to dislodge my fear. We were all on edge. Corin complained that her entire lyric notebook had vanished overnight, not just a single page. She looked close to tears. Amity, normally cheerful, fidgeted as if expecting something awful to leap out from behind the cupboards. Gilbert paced around, glancing nervously at his watch, as though waiting for an alarm that never came. Elias remained calm as a statue, sipping cocoa. "Maybe something's just wrong with the lodge," he offered softly. "Places like this are old. They sometimes hide things in plain sight." Later that day, we decided to search from top to bottom for our missing items. Aunt Belinda excused herself to fix a broken fuse downstairs. We spread out across the bedrooms. I chose to investigate Elias's room, mostly out of a gnawing curiosity I couldn't contain. My heart hammered in my ears as I eased open his closet door. I told myself I'd merely do a quick glance, but a single glance turned into a thorough search. Behind a pile of folded clothes, I noticed a small crate. Inside it, I found my grandmother's locket, Gilbert's pen, and Corin's lyric pages. Beneath those items lay a handful of random trinkets, including a silly candy tin that had to be Amity's. Stunned, I nearly dropped them. Why would Elias take these? Then I spotted a narrow leather journal wedged under the crate. Trembling, I lifted the cover. Its pages were filled with detailed drawings in thick black ink. At first, they seemed to be bizarre sketches of deserted hallways and faceless silhouettes. But as I flipped deeper, the pictures turned sinister. Twisted figures with hollow eyes, people pinned to walls, entire rooms scrawled over with frantic markings. Some pages showed images that resembled me, or Gilbert, or Amity, or Corin, as though Elias had been observing us and capturing distorted versions of our faces. At the bottom of one sketch, I recognized my own face, and behind it was a maze of lines like spider webs. I felt sick. The final pages were the most horrifying. They showed a tall shape looming over a sleeping figure, lines swirling as if representing nightmares. Below that image, in Elias's neat handwriting, was a short sentence: "I will finish what I started." I slapped the journal shut and pressed a hand over my mouth, stifling a gasp. My knees felt weak. All the warmth seemed to drain from the room. My immediate thought was to rush out and confront him, but fear stilled my movements. Elias could be anywhere in the lodge. Maybe he was in the corridor right then, listening. Eventually, I forced myself to gather all the stolen things, including the notebook, and I scurried to find Aunt Belinda. I ran into Amity first, breathless and wide-eyed, and told her everything. At that moment, Elias appeared at the far end of the hall, silent and unreadable, as though waiting for us to speak. Amity grabbed my arm and pulled me into the kitchen, where Aunt Belinda was sorting tools for the fuse box. The instant Aunt Belinda saw my terrified expression, she demanded an explanation. I had trouble forming words, but finally showed her the items and the journal. Her eyes widened and she took in a sharp breath. She insisted we pack our bags immediately. There was no way we were staying another night in a place that suddenly felt so unsafe. She told Gilbert and Corin to gather their belongings, instructing us to stay together at all times. Amity hovered beside me, tearful but steady, as I returned the recovered items to my friends. Corin clutched her lyric pages like they were the only things holding her together. Gilbert thanked me quietly, barely able to look anyone in the eye. Elias was nowhere to be seen during this scramble, which only heightened my dread. Every whisper of wind, every footstep made me flinch. At last, Aunt Belinda herded us into her pickup. We were halfway down the winding mountain road when I noticed Elias was in the truck bed, huddled against the side, his gaze unfocused. Aunt Belinda forced the vehicle to a halt on the icy road. "We're taking you home," she said, in a voice trembling between anger and concern. We all sat in stunned silence as she confronted him. Elias offered no defense, no apology, just stared at his boots and mumbled something about needing to keep his promises. Nobody spoke much on the drive back to town, the truck rattling over bumps. Amity kept her eyes on the passing scenery. Gilbert buried his face in a worn library book. Corin fiddled with her lyric pages as if trying to will the memory of the lodge out of existence. I was squeezed between them, mind buzzing with questions. Why had Elias taken our belongings? What were the drawings about? And what promise was he talking about? Once we reached Aunt Belinda's cozy two-story home in the valley, she called Elias's guardian, an older cousin, if I recall correctly, and explained the situation. The conversation was brief. I only caught fragments, but it seemed as though his family was not surprised. "He's been struggling," she said, wincing. "Yes, I understand. We'll wait." Over an hour later, his guardian arrived and drove him away. I caught a final glimpse of Elias's face through the car window. His expression was stony, almost sorrowful. I hoped never to see him again. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those sketches. In my dreams, the corridors of Silver Hearth Lodge twisted into endless loops, and Elias stood at the center, clutching that leather journal. Whenever I tried to scream, no sound would leave my throat. Time passed. Corin eventually composed a haunting ballad about ghosts in lonely places. Gilbert buried himself in new scientific pursuits, building intricate contraptions in his father's workshop. Amity made it her mission to cheer me up daily, bringing jokes and witty remarks to lighten my mood. Aunt Belinda apologized countless times for not spotting warning signs. She had the locks changed at the lodge, and I overheard her mention something about wanting an exorcism or a blessing. She never was particularly superstitious, but that's how rattled she was by the whole ordeal. I tried to move on, focusing on school and everyday life, though I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder whenever I heard footsteps behind me in the hallway. About 6 years later, when I was 20, I left our small town for a temporary bookkeeping job in the city. On my second day there, I found a small envelope slipped under my apartment door. There was no return address. Inside was my grandmother's locket, the one Elias had first taken. Tucked beside it was a folded scrap of paper that read, in neat handwriting, "I never forgot what happened." A chill ran up my arms. No signature, no explanation. Just that simple statement and the long-lost locket gleaming in the light of my cramped hallway. And it wasn't her. I nearly dropped it. All the memories of Silver Hearth Lodge, the missing pages, the stolen items, and that dreadful journal came rushing back, as vivid as if it had happened the day before. I stared at the paper for a long time, my heart pounding. Finally, I placed the locket in a drawer, folded the note, and hid it beneath a stack of old letters. That was where I left it, unsure what to do next or how to feel. Part of me wanted to believe this was Elias's strange attempt at closure. Another part imagined something darker, like a warning that he could still slip into my life whenever he chose. Sometimes I dream of returning to Silver Hearth Lodge, hoping to prove to myself that I am no longer afraid. But a deeper instinct tells me not to go, not to open that door again. Even now, whenever I recall those drawings, the hush of the corridors, the anxious nights listening for whispering footsteps, I feel goosebumps prickle along my skin. I wonder if he still has more of my belongings stashed away, if he's watching from somewhere just out of sight, or if he's moved on to an entirely different obsession. I'm not sure which possibility scares me more. All I can do is press on, day by day. I'll keep the locket in my drawer. Some days I'm tempted to throw it away. Other days I consider wearing it like a talisman. So far, I haven't done either. But every so often I slide the drawer open and look at it, remembering the flicker of the fireplace in that grand old lodge, the hush of those snowy mountains, and the tightness in my chest the moment I discovered Elias's journal. My world changed that winter, and I guess part of me never quite left those creaking halls behind. I remain torn between relief that nothing worse happened back then and dread that the story isn't finished. If Elias could find me now, who's to say he won't do so again, or that his intentions are any less unsettling? The question keeps me awake some nights, haunted by the notion that the past can resurface at the most unexpected moments. For now, I stay vigilant, reminding myself that I survived once and I can survive again, even if shadows from that lonely lodge still linger in the corners of my mind. I was 13 when my Uncle Nico took me and 3 friends to his farm on the outskirts of Gresham's Hollow. It wasn't much of a farm anymore. His health had taken a turn and the crops had long since gone to seed. But the house still stood, perched like an old crow at the edge of a field that stretched farther than the eye could see. Nico called it his sanctuary. I called it eerie. My friends were just as intrigued as I was. There was Dara, always brimming with jokes that made even the gloomiest days feel bright. Ezra, a quiet genius who spent his time tinkering with gadgets, and Samir, whose curiosity often led us into trouble. We had been inseparable since we were kids, though I sensed lately that we were all growing in different directions. That summer I hoped the trip would bring us back together. It did, but not in the way I imagined. Nico picked us up in his battered truck, its cab smelling of hay and oil. The ride was bumpy and long, but none of us complained. We passed through woods that seemed darker than they should have been, the trees so dense they swallowed the sunlight. When we finally arrived, the farm looked even more run down than I remembered. The windows were clouded with grime and the porch leaned to one side, as if the house had grown tired of standing upright. "Make yourselves at home," Nico said, waving us inside. He was a wiry man with a thick beard and kind eyes that always seemed to hide a secret. "Just don't go digging around where you don't belong. This place has its fair share of ghosts." He chuckled, but there was something off about the way he said it. The first few days passed without incident. We explored the property, picking wild blackberries and racing through the fields. At night, we sat around the kitchen table, playing card games under the dim light of a single bulb. Nico told us stories about the farm's history, tales of strange lights in the woods and voices carried on the wind. We laughed them off, though his tone made it hard to tell if he was joking. On the 3rd day, I noticed a door at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was locked, the keyhole rusted over. When I asked Nico about it, he shrugged. "That room's been sealed for years," he said. "Nothing in there but dust and bad memories." Of course, that only made us more curious. Samir, being the boldest among us, declared he'd find a way to open it. That evening, while Nico was out tending to his chickens, Samir found a skeleton key hanging on a hook in the kitchen. "This has to be it," he said, grinning. We gathered at the locked door, the key trembling in Samir's hand. When it turned with a heavy click, my stomach tightened. The air behind the door smelled stale, like rotting wood, and something else I couldn't place. The room was small and empty, except for an old chest in the corner. "Should we open it?" Dara asked, her voice tinged with excitement and fear. "We didn't come this far just to stop now," Samir said. Inside the chest, we found a collection of items that didn't seem to belong together. A cracked porcelain doll, a bundle of letters tied with twine, and a small leather journal. Ezra picked up the journal, flipping through its pages. His face paled. "These are drawings," he said. "Weird ones," he said. "Weird ones." He handed it to me and my breath caught. The pages were filled with sketches of shadowy figures, their faces obscured or missing entirely. Some pages had frantic scribbles, circles within circles, intersecting lines that formed labyrinths. One page had a detailed drawing of the farm, but the field was filled with strange symbols. The final pages were the most disturbing. They showed people, children I realized, trapped in dark spaces, their faces twisted in terror. Below one drawing was a single sentence: "It always finds them." After that, things began to go missing. First it was small items, a flashlight here, a notebook there. Then it was Ezra's pocket watch, a family heirloom he always kept on him. Dara lost her favorite scarf. Samir swore he had misplaced his phone, though he never went anywhere without it. At first we laughed it off, teasing each other about being careless. But as the days passed, the laughter stopped. Sam stood erect, as Dara erect. As Darius laughed, it stopped. It felt deliberate, targeted. One night I woke to a faint rustling outside my window. I peeked through the curtain and saw something moving in the field. At first I thought it was Nico, but the figure was too tall, its movements too erratic. It seemed to dissolve into the shadows whenever I tried to focus on it. My heart raced as I crawled back into bed, pulling the blanket over my head. The next morning Ezra looked exhausted. He admitted he had heard whispers outside his room but hadn't dared to investigate. It sounded like it was calling my name, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. On our last night at the farm, Nico went into town, leaving us alone. We locked every door and window, too afraid to venture outside. Around midnight I heard footsteps in the hallway. I thought it was Samir, but when I stepped out, the hall was empty. It started to rain again, causing the house to vibrate to its foundation, but it seamless windows. My mother asked if I was upstairs. I lied. The air felt heavy, like the house was holding its breath. I returned to my room, only to find the leather journal sitting on my bed. My chest tightened. I hadn't touched it since the day we opened the chest. The journal was open to a blank page, but as I stared, words began to appear, written in a shaky hand. "Leave, now. It knows." Before I could react, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. We all ran to Dara's room, where we found her huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. "It was in here," she whispered, "watching me." We didn't wait for Nico to return. Grabbing our bags, we piled into his truck and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. The journal came with us, though none of us remembered packing it. Back home, I tried to forget the farm, but the memories lingered. Ezra buried himself in his gadgets, refusing to talk about what happened. Dara moved away, and we lost touch. Samir joked about it at first, but even he grew quieter over time. 2 years later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was the journal, along with a note written in the same shaky hand. "It still remembers you." I burned the journal that night, but I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear whispers, faint and distant, as though they're coming from the edge of the field, and I wonder if it's still watching.